Okay, hello everyone. This is Chapter 4, Gender and Sexuality. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about a lot of the development of individuals from in utero, from puberty, and then later on in adulthood. We'll be talking about a lot of the characteristics of the body as it grows, so primary and secondary sex characteristics. We'll be discussing gender roles and how we assume gender is with different cultures based upon the cultural expectations. We'll be talking about how we learn to develop our own gender identity. We'll be discussing the importance of sex hormones, talking about hormones' influence on the male and female brain, and then talking about the sexual response cycle. After that, we'll be talking about different types of sexual dysfunctions, and then we'll finish up by discussing sexual orientation. So the first thing I wanted you to do is I wanted you to consider the word sex. And I want you to think about what that means to you. I'm sure that if you took out like pen and paper, you'd be able to just write down at least 20 different meanings to the word sex. It could be cultural, it could be religion, it could be based upon what your family values are, it could be what your friends say, it could be what you see on the media or hear through songs. There's a lot of influence about this particular word, sex. And we're only talking about the action right there, the verb of sex. There's also the idea of sexual orientation, your sexual identity, and your biological sex. So we're talking about anatomy as well. So whether we're discussing babies or marriage and committed relationships, or we're talking about competition for mates, or we're talking about STIs, sexual transmitted infections, or writing poetry to, swoon someone else and make them your partner. There are a lot of different associations and a lot of different reasons that sex is a loaded word. And so when we discuss all these different facets of it, I want you to consider your own ideals of what is sex and how it relates towards the general public. So to begin, we're going to start at the very beginning. So fertilization from the sperm and the egg. When this occurs, we start to see the combination of chromosomes. So you have 46 chromosomes in total. Half of those come from your mother and half of them come from your father. So 20, 23, and 23. Around the 7th week, one of the chromosomes is passed down from your father. It's referred to as the only sex chromosome. Is it going to be either an X chromosome or a Y chromosome? Now, X will signify that the child will grow up biologically female, and Y signifies that they will grow up biologically male. Now, up until the 7th week, both sexes are indistinguishable. Both of their genitals are very indistinguishable and they look very similar. But it's at that 7th week when we start to see a switch that's flipped based upon this final chromosome that indicates what type of biological sex the individual will grow into. Now, it's not until the 4th and 5th month that we start to see sex hormones that get released and bathe the fetal brain that starts to influence its wiring for a preference for sexual identity. So it's at this point when we start to see some of the main sex hormones like testosterone or estrogen start to influence the preference of the child early on in development. So at that point, you start to see a lot of these sex hormones influencing not only the physiology, but also the preferences of the baby. So, like I said, we really begin life with undifferentiated structures for human genitalia. As shown in the center here, this is the gonad of a fetus, and if you look at the blue section, you can see that it'll either develop into ovaries, shown on the left, or testes, shown on the right. So the Mullerian duct, which is right here, That develops into the female's uterus, oviducts, and the upper part of the vagina, while the Wolffian duct, right here, of the fetus develops into the male's seminal vesicles, which store semen, and the vas deferens, which is a duct from the testes into the penis. So the Mullerian duct will degenerate in males, and the Wolffian duct will degenerate in females. So based upon that last chromosome, that sex chromosome, it will indicate whether the genitals of an embryo is going to, or a fetus is going to grow into either female or male. Now, this is going to depend mostly on the level of testosterone that's released during the sensitive period. And the sensitive period is usually the first trimester, which is 1 to around 12 weeks of pregnancy. So at first, the external genitals of males and females look the same. They're undifferentiated. But it's that sensitive period that we start to see that switch flip, and the biological sex of the fetus starts to actually develop. Now, when I say testosterone, we'll talk a little bit more about sex hormones, but testosterone is often associated as more of a male sexual hormone. However, it is released for both men and for males and females, so it's not primarily only for biological males. And we'll talk about its influence through the entire lifespan in a couple more slides. Now, there are individuals, it's estimated that around 1 in 2,000 individuals have a degree of genital ambiguity when they're born, so it makes their sex uncertain. And it can be very difficult for them to really find each other or be able to have a support group because there's a lot of hospital confidentiality for intersex individuals. Intersex, previously referred to as hermaphrodite. So these are people with anatomies that are intermediate between male and female, or a mixture. And one of the main causes for this is that the mother will often release 2 ova, which are 2 eggs, which each become fertilized by different sperm. If that does happen, they can become twins. However, in certain situations, the ova can actually unite and instead become an individual. And when that occurs, there can be an atypical hormone pattern that occurs before birth that can influence a lot of that genital ambiguity. So we're moving forward and we're talking about puberty at this point, and when it usually starts to occur and we start to see the development of different sexual characteristics. So typically, and a lot of these ages do change, but typically it starts at around 11 years old in girls and 13-year-olds in boys. So with puberty, you start to see a surge of hormones that trigger a period of rapid physical development. One of the main structures that helps this development is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, often referred to as the master gland, will wake up other hormonal glands to encourage them to start developing and start surging through the body. So the pituitary during puberty is going to wake up a lot of those sexual organs, the genitals, to start producing these sex hormones and release them in a greater quantity. So we have the testes for males and the ovaries for females. Now, your primary sex characteristics, these are the ones that are primarily important for reproduction. We start to see the testes with the growth of the penis and the testes, and the beginning of ejaculation. So this is called spermarchy, which is the first ejaculation in boys. For females, we start to see the ovaries that are developing a lot of the estrogens that are influencing these primary sex characteristics. So we see enlargement of the uterus and the beginning of menstruation. So menarche is the first menstrual period in girls. In the contrast, we also see secondary sex characteristics start to develop. While primary sex characteristics are important for reproduction, secondary are much more of a byproduct of the release of all these sex hormones. So for males, we start to see facial and underarm hair growth, pubic hair growth, and the larynx start to enlarge, which deepens the voice. And for female, we start to see the breast development, underarm hair growth, and pubic hair growth develop as well. Now, secondary sex characteristics are not as important for reproduction as primary are, and that's one of the main differences right there. Okay, so now we're going to do our first activity. This is activity number 1. And what I would like you to do is take out a blank piece of paper, and I want you to write down 1 through 20. So you're going to be numbering 1 through 20. And it doesn't have to be a blank piece of paper. This could be on a computer. But I want you to be able to write very quickly. So if it works better to write it down on a piece of paper and take a picture of that, or just import that over into what activity you're going to be submitting, then I'm perfectly fine with that. Now, you're going to see about 20 words appear, one at a time, and they're only going to be on screen for about 2 seconds. Your job is to write down whether you think they describe a masculine or a feminine trait. So they're going to move by very quickly. And I'm going to be calling out or naming out what these terms are. And so you won't have to look at it if you don't want to. You can look down at your paper and write down. And then to make it easier on you, I'm going to ask you to either write down an M for masculine or an F for feminine. Okay, are you ready? Number 1, self-reliant. Number 2, compassionate. Number 3, shy. Number 4, analytical. Number 5, dominant. Number 6, ambitious. Number 7, loyal. Number 8, understanding. Number 9, assertive. Number 10, cheerful. Number 11, affectionate. Number 12, independent. Number 13, aggressive. Number 14, sympathetic. Number 15, athletic. Number 16, childlike. Number 17, tender. Number 18, individualistic. Number 19, competitive. Number 20, gullible. Okay, so before we jump into this, before we start to discuss this, I want you to consider what was the point of this. There's a couple variables that are being discussed here, aren't there? At first, we've got the trying to assign either masculine or feminine to specific traits, and we also have a lot of things that are influencing that. So if you consider where those assignments and those definitions usually come from, they usually come from one's culture. They usually come from what society tells us, whether something is masculine or feminine. Or they could come from your family, whether you saw your caregivers, your parents, your mother or your father, or maybe other family members demonstrate these particular traits. And I have a sneaking suspicion that your definitions, whether you say it's masculine or feminine, is going to differ from everyone else's. It's going to be based largely on your own life. But there often are commonalities with a majority of them. And I think that culture is one of those that tends to define a lot of that generalization. Now, I know that this can be very controversial, but there have been in the past other college students in college classes that have taken this particular inventory, this test, and they've compiled a lot of their general responses to see what the most common responses are. So we're going to be looking at a lot of those right here. So what do you think? Does this match a lot of the ones that you yourself got? Do you start to see a lot of commonalities, or do you see a lot of differences based upon what you've written? And also, this particular inventory, which is referred to as the BEM Sex Role Inventory, and has been given out for decades to different classes, has been changing with recent times. So what in today's culture has been influencing that? It's absolutely something to consider and something to debate about. And I encourage you to look into the reason for this test. Because not only was I asking you to name or define these particular traits, but I was also asking you to do it within seconds. The reason for that is because I'm asking you to give a split-second response, which often represents one's individual biases. A lot of inventories like this, a lot of bias inventories, are actually developed by colleges to look into the individual biases that people have. And we all have them, whether it is riding the bus with someone, or talking to individuals, or walking down the street at night. We all have individual biases that influence our decisions, even if we try to act against them. And so these inventories can be very useful for seeing where those biases exist. Now, that's not a bad thing. It's just important to understand what influences them. And since culture is one of the predominant reasons for this, I think that it's important to understand where that comes from and question yourself where that comes from. So this right here, this activity is referred to as gender typing. It's an acquisition of a traditional masculine or feminine psychological characteristic. And it's something that we often try to ask individuals to self-reflect, because it tells a lot about one's own individual, like how they grew up and what influences their individual mentality. So this will be activity number 1. So hold on to this, and once we finish the other activities, you can turn those in together. Going along with this idea of assigning masculine or feminine with particular traits or characteristics, if we look here at some of these examples, we're trying to understand whether something is masculine or feminine, or an individual is masculine and feminine. So a firefighter that frequently works out and goes bar hopping. Oftentimes, individuals are going to assign firefighters to a more masculine job, as opposed to a ballerina with an eating disorder. You might be considering more of a feminine job. But once we get into some of these other ones, it becomes a little harder. A corporate CEO or a straight-A student. So a lot of these are going to be difficult or easier based upon how much bias is associated with a particular role. So how do we define male or female? Well, let's go through some definitions together. First is gender, and gender is socially constructed roles in which culture defines male or female. Look at this right here, socially constructed. That means that gender itself is going to differ based upon where you are, what culture you're in. And a lot of cultures have different definitions for what is considered masculine acts versus feminine acts. Gender roles. These are expected behaviors of males or females, often driven from the socially constructed or cultural definitions. And this can extend towards jobs and careers as well. And then gender identity. This is our sense of being male or female. We have a particular idea of what constructs us as male or female, and we tend to exemplify those traits outwards. So this is what's really going to help you differentiate a lot of those characteristics versus someone else in class. Now, saying just purely masculine or feminine is very polarizing. And I'm sure that when we did the inventory, a lot of you were thinking, well, why not both? You might be considering that there have been role models in your own life that exemplified both of those characteristics. And so it might have been more difficult to assign just a characteristic as purely male or purely female. So this is where androgyny comes in. Androgyny is a combination of masculine and feminine traits in one individual. And so it often shows a great repertoire of traits to draw on with one's daily lives. Studies have looked into androgynous individuals and have found that they tend to be more flexible and creative than other children of their age. And often androgynous women are better at saying no to unreasonable requests from other individuals. So, let's reflect a little bit on what we've learned. How many chromosomes are unisex? Meaning, how many of them are not reliant on changing the sex of an individual? 45. 45 are unisex, with the final chromosome, the 46, that is actually passed down from the father that will institute whether a fetus becomes biologically male or biologically female, dependent on that 46 chromosome, whether it is Y or it is X. What is the difference between primary and secondary sex characteristics? Primary, its main purpose is for making sexual reproduction possible. So this will be the influence on the ovaries and the testes, the genitals. While secondary are often non-reproductive sexual traits that are byproducts of the influence of sexual hormones. So we have breasts, male voice deepening, and body hair. Going back to gender identity, we oftentimes want to know, how do we learn to be male or female? There tends to be an overwhelming feeling early in life for children to just understand that their biological sex orientates towards how they feel, their sexual identity. So one theory is called the social learning theory. And this is that we observe and imitate other genders that are linked behaviors between what we're doing and the rewards and punishments that come with them. So oftentimes we will follow our parents, or we have role models and other family members or even friends that tend to exemplify certain traits. We copy those and we're either rewarded or punished based upon that. And it tends to mold which way our particular gender identity is going. We also develop schemas. If you remember, schemas are kind of like an organizational device for words. So if we develop a schema of what a traditional male and traditional female looks like, then we're developing a sense of identity based upon that organizational definition. So if you're looking at females that typically wear dresses or skirts, then you might assume that that clothing style is typical of females. But if you come in contact with someone who maybe wears a kilt, you may confuse that clothing style and need to assimilate your schemas to develop a new one. That there are particular clothing styles that also that aren't only worn by females but also are worn by males. Now, individuals whose gender identity differs from their biological birth sex are referred to as transgendered individuals. And we're going to watch a quick video about a transgendered individual, a young boy, and the parents, with their conflict, trying to help the child develop the way that he wants to.
Tonight we're taking a closer look at something that's been getting a lot of attention recently, the subject of being transgender. We've seen adults share their stories on television shows and in magazines, but rarely do we hear from the youngest members of the transgender community. Tonight, our national correspondent Kate Snow is here with one family's very personal story. Kate?
Lester, good evening. By some estimates, there are 700,000 adults in the U.S. who are transgender, and while we don't know the exact number of children, increasingly families are going public with what it means to be a transgender kid. 5-year-old Jacob LeMay is fierce. He loves karate and dogs and spaceships and playing with his sisters. So 2 sisters and you're the brother, right?
Yeah.
Were you always the brother?
Not always.
What were you before?
They're a sister.
How come it changed?
Because I wanted to be a boy.
In the beginning, Mimi and Joe LeMay were raising 3 girls. But when Mia was around 2, she started saying, "I'm a boy." Did you think it was a phase?
I hoped it was a phase.
Mia learned to write her name, but would immediately scribble it out. Jacob still remembers.
I didn't like to write that name. I wanted to write Jacob.
Jacob?
Yeah.
Jacob. You already picked it out, right?
Yeah.
You look beautiful right now. Even something as simple as a haircut wasn't.
What do you think, Mia? I want someone to cut my hair, and I want it to be like that.
Minnie didn't know what to think.
I even found him kind of poking at himself, saying things like, why did God make me this way? Why did God make me wrong? I was confused and concerned, and I hoped that this obsession with being a boy would go away.
But it only grew stronger. The LeMays went searching for answers.
Her need to play boy roles and her need to be seen or spoken to as a boy at home became very persistent and very consistent. Those are the hallmarks of a possibly transgender child. Consistence, persistence, and insistence. And she was meeting all those markers.
Pediatrician Dr. Michelle Forcier says gender identity is formed very early.
It's not a fad or a phase. And I tell parents that even though they may feel or want to believe that. Your 4-year-old probably knew that they were a boy or a girl at 3, 4, 5 years old, and that's a normal part of child development.
Last spring, the LeMays went to Disney World and let their 4-year-old dress as Prince Charming.
He was really happy in that moment. He was being perceived as he wanted to.
After agonizing for years, Minnie and Joe say they knew it was time to listen to their son.
I explained to him that we can bring you to a new school and everyone will know you as a boy from the beginning. Right then he said, that's what I want.
He said, I want to be a boy always. I want to be a boy named Jacob.
And so last June, they cut his hair short, asked family and friends to call him Jacob, and let him live publicly as a boy.
He hasn't had any medical procedures, not on hormones, right?
Yeah, that won't
way too soon for that.
Way too soon for that.
People are going to hear your story and think 4 is really young. But a mother's heart knows when her child is suffering.
All of this is new terrain, but many doctors who work with transgender kids now support families making the transition at an early age.
We have a long history of children who have been shut down and told, no, you can't be a boy, or no, you're not a girl. We know those kids suffer, and there's a host of bad health outcomes and psychiatric outcomes.
People who are transgender face a greater risk of anxiety and depression, and according to a 2011 survey, a startling 41% had attempted suicide.
So would you tell parents that in some ways it's riskier to wait?
Absolutely. In fact, what I say, the biggest harm is to do nothing.
Ultimately, Jacob has made that choice in his mind and his heart. It's whether or not we accept it or not.
Accept it, that's right.
And now, Jacob says he's proud of who he is.
What are you proud of about yourself?
Cause I'm a boy.
You look really handsome. Are you ready for today? Are you ready for school?
Yeah.
Okay. I want him to know how proud I am of him, how brave I believe he is, and how no matter what, I am in his corner, and I love him, and I always will, because he's my son. This really has been a journey for Jacob and his family. They have a long time before they even need to consider whether he wants medical intervention. Tomorrow we'll bring you the story of another transgender child who's a few years old.
Okay. So in watching that video and looking at a younger child who feels this disconnect between their gender identity and their biological sex, it can be very difficult oftentimes for us to understand. And it's incredibly helpful for us to understand biologically, psychologically, what is occurring so that we can be able to help out individuals who require that help out. So for an individual, transgendered individual or transsexual individual who actually has this disconnect, the sense of anxiety and stress that's associated with this disconnect between how they feel and their gender and their biological sex, this is referred to as gender dysphoria. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders often has a lot of criteria to be hit for an individual to be considered with gender dysphoria. And it's one of the main requirements, prerequisites before an individual transitions into the surgery required for transitioning into a different biological sex. This surgery will often have to have a recommendation by two mental health specialists who are trained in gender identity issues and both agree on a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. The individual has to engage in hormone treatment for at least 1 year, in which they live their true life, meaning how they truly feel their biological sex is, for a minimum of 1 year. And they also have to have emotional stability throughout that time before they're even considered for surgery. So there's a lot of requirements that make it not only just a desire or a whim in order for a person to transition. Remember, when a fetus is in utero, the 4th and 5th month is when the sex hormones start to influence, they start to wire the brain to either be more masculine or more feminine. And this is theorized to be the time in which individuals are, where they help identify whether they're more male or female. And so, even though a lot of us may not have the same understanding of this, I encourage you to look deeper into understanding transgendered individuals and understanding the plight that comes with it. Your textbook has a lot of information in regards to it, but if you'd like more, please reach out. I'd be glad to share that with you. So speaking of these hormones, let's start talking about them. We mentioned some previously, like testosterone. So the androgens, which is a group of primarily male hormones, one of the most common is referred to as testosterone, and it's produced often more common in males through the testes. And then you have estrogens. The most common is estradiol and progesterone, which prepares the uterus for implantation of a fertilized ovum, an egg, and promotes the maintenance of pregnancy. So hormones not only influence our identity, our gender identity, and our desires, but also our biological characteristics and our biological sex. So at any time in life, sex hormones exert activating effects to temporarily modify behavior. And these behaviors can also influence the hormone secretion itself, meaning that how you feel can influence how many hormones are released in your body. And also your hormones can influence how you're feeling at any given moment. Oxytocin, which is often referred to as the bonding neurotransmitter, is something that's important for reproductive behavior and stimulates the uterine contractions during delivery and mammary glands to release milk. So it is also something that increases sexual pleasure, and especially during orgasm. So we're going to finish up this video discussing the menstrual cycle and pregnancy, and a lot of the influences of hormones during these different stages. In women, the hypothalamus, remember the hypothalamus is the section of the brain that controls a lot of the regulation of the body, so making sure that the body is well balanced with temperature, hunger, sleep. And so it's looking to balance off a lot of the levels, including hormones. So in the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is that master gland that wakes up other glands and tells them to produce their specific hormones. They interact with the ovaries to produce the menstrual cycle. And the menstrual cycle itself is a periodic variation or a course of about 28 days. So it happens in the uterus to prepare for a fertilized egg. You also have the ovarian cycle, and this is the maturation of a follicle, an egg. So growing a particular egg so it's ready for fertilization and then implantation. Right here we have the interactions between the pituitary gland and the ovaries. So what generally will happen is that first off, the interactions between the pituitary and the ovary relies on one particular hormone, FSH. This is called the follicle stimulating hormone. So what it's going to do is, during this menstrual cycle, the pituitary gland is going to send FSH over to the ovaries. And when it sends it, it's going to encourage a follicle to start to grow, to become an egg. And when it does grow and it's ready and it's mature, it's going to release estradiol. So estradiol is going to be sent back over to the pituitary gland, and this lets the pituitary know that it's released, or that it's ready to be released. When it's ready to be released, the pituitary is going to send that follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and then another hormone called luteinizing hormone. So this is LH. Those hormones cause the follicle to release its ovum and become a corpus luteum. So the ovum is going to be released, the egg is going to be released down the tract, and the corpus luteum, the leftover section of it, is going to stay in the ovary. Its job when it discards the ovum is going to be to disintegrate, but also to release the final hormone, progesterone. And this is going to signify to the pituitary that it's released and it doesn't need to release any more estradiol, or any more FSH and LH. So it stops the menstrual process at that point. If a woman is pregnant, estradiol and progesterone levels increase gradually throughout pregnancy. And if not, levels of both decline and the uterine lining is cast off, which is what menstruation is. High levels of estradiol and progesterone produce heightened activity in the serotonin receptors. And so serotonin has a lot to do with regulation and emotions, but it can also cause nausea that's associated with pregnancy for individuals. The birth control pill will actually interrupt or interfere the feedback cycle between the ovaries and the pituitary gland. So the combination pill will contain estrogen and progesterone, so it prevents the FSH and the LH hormones that would be released to the ovum. It prevents them from occurring. So by doing that, it stops the ovum from being released, making it so it can't be fertilized. It also does several other things to the body, such as thickening the mucus of the cervix, and it makes it more difficult for sperm to reach an egg. Also prevents an egg from implanting in the uterus. So, in talking about the importance of a lot of these hormones, there are three main important things that often influence the importance of hormones. The first is it directs our development as male or female in the prenatal period. That's our biological sex, but also our sexual identity. Number two is that it surges us into puberty, developing those primary and secondary sex characteristics. And the fourth is that sex hormones activate sexual behaviors. So we'll be talking about sexual behaviors in the next video. Last thing I wanted to leave you with before we stopped here is that cornflakes in the early 1900s was actually developed as a method to stop individuals from masturbating. There was a time in which we believed that people masturbated because they had a imbalanced diet or an imbalanced breakfast, and they weren't receiving enough grains. So cornflakes was one of the reasons it was developed, is to stop individuals from engaging in that self-pleasure activity. So we're going to talk about a lot of these misconceptions and also talk about the history of our sexual response cycle and later on sexual orientation.